Alright, so I'm going to be talking about likely the most famous new creature from Elden Ring, the living jars, which were originally referred to as pot goblins. Even more so when people met the warrior jar Iron Fist Alexander stuck in a hole during a closed networks test. They realized he clearly was going to occupy a Sigurd Siegmeyer-esque Knight of Katarina type role. Character strong, fearless, and good-natured, if a bit bumbling at times. It wasn't until I accidentally hit him and let him kill me when he said, "In you go," with the rest of them, that I began to theorize about the nature of the living jars. Like, what are they? Who made them? What is their purpose? Before we can even theorize an answer, we have to kind of go over what we know about them, which, like most of these games, is through various item descriptions, along with a couple here throwaway lines from dialogue for NPCs. Before we get into the nature of the jars or their possible creators, though, we must go over the observations we have of the ones that live in places like the catacombs and legacy dungeons. Now, they appear to either be residents of these secluded places or guarding them, though the former seems a bit more likely than the latter when you consider the description of the living jar shard that states, "The jars often find themselves to be the target of poachers." And indeed, this can be witnessed during a specific questline involving a settlement called Jarburg, which we will get into later. The ones in these dungeons, though, are often docile until some item is picked up or a lever is pulled. Some of them even appear to suicide bomb you like some type of kamikaze variant, and there are also black jars that I believe blow up when you destroy them. From this, we could also theorize that they are highly territorial, at least when they're found in these secluded places or to be guarding something. They don't like intruders, except in the, occasional sense, like in Volcano Manor, where I believe you could sit amongst the jars near the lava, which, according to dialogue from Alexander, could be that these jars are tempering themselves, making themselves stronger by being near the lava and magma, as he does in his questline. Other small observations would be that they aren't like the demi-humans who, when you kill their leader, the others back down. Contrary to that, if you kill the big jar, the smaller jars will still continue attacking you until you kill them or run away, and they, de-aggro. And one of the final of my stray observations would be the jars that line and circle the minor Erd trees that are found throughout the map. Now, there appear to be the remains of several of these great jar warriors that fell here, or they came here, maybe seeking tears, possibly, or maybe to face the Erd tree avatar as some form of rite of passage. But all that can be said is that they don't appear to have been successful, or perhaps it's a location where people who are trying to scavenge more parts to repair themselves with could find, repair pieces. Who knows, really? That's the whole thing with these games, is you kind of have to theorize things on your own. That's the whole purpose of this video. But anyway, another observation that is to be made is that there appear to be other jars besides just the warrior jars. As we find at Jarburg, several of them are engaging in gardening, planting flowers, agriculture, and they seem to really just be enjoying it. They don't appear to be seeking any challenges. One NPC you meet there is an aspiring warrior jar, and he seems to fit with the other ones you've met, but namely Alexander. As we know, the warrior jars, they're filled with the remains of the stewed flesh of dead warriors. It could be that these ones are filled with the dead flesh and dead remains of various gardeners, artists, people who like to relax, and they're just living out their days as a conglomerate of beings living inside a sentient jar, which, it fits right in with the world of Dark Souls and Soulsborne, and that Elden Ring is denying death is a big theme in these games throughout several of the quest lines, or at least, subverting it. Now, to get into the item descriptions, where we learn a lot more of this lore from, would be the first of which to be mentioned is the jar given to you by Alexander from Cressina's questline. It works as a helmet. It says it fits cleanly over the head when upturned, made with pride by Iron Fist Alexander. It is a uniquely jar-like gesture of friendship that boosts the power of throwing pot items. Now, what this tells us is that the jars are uniquely friendly. They're friendly with their own spin on it. For example, Alexander is this warrior jar who clearly is your best friend, but he also views you as a type of rival, similar to the way Sigurd might in the Dark Souls titles. He respects you and he holds you to high regard, but he wants to defeat you. But at the same time, he's giving you gifts, similar to Sigurd and his Siegbrows. Now, the next item on the list would be the living jar shard, which I've already mentioned. It says a fragment of a living jar hardened after its death, material used for crafting items. Such fragments command a high price due to their magical power locked within. This leaves the living jars unfortunate targets for poachers, which is a subject I've already touched on about these, is that they're hunted by poachers. Poachers we never really see in game, but their actions are felt and seen throughout certain quest lines. Now, what this item description, it says other than that is that there's a type of magical power imbued within the jars, the material that the jars are made out of. Possibly, this is what keeps them, sentient and able to walk around, to be alive, to give them the gift of life. It also says, use the unique term of magical, so it says they're likely created by sorcerers of some kind or possibly alchemists. But other than that, there isn't much more to be gleaned from this piece. Next up, we have the very cool and unique Jar White puppet. It says, one of Selvis's puppets, used to summon the spirit of a Jar White, spirit of a man who wished to become the innards of a living jar, a jar-hurling specialist who throws all manner of pots and jars. The warrior jar once told the nameless man, "You are not yet ready to join the warriors inside. No, you must apply yourself, better yourself, and one day I will return for you." Now, this tells us that the jars, even when they have like a fanboy, they're not just going to willingly take anybody and add them to the conglomerate of beings inside their jar. Now, they have to be worthy individuals, which we see throughout Alexander's questline, and to a lesser extent jar barons, to where it's not just going to be anybody. They need to have worthy individuals within the jar. And Jar White is an interesting thing where I saw a bunch of Reddit posts and on the Fextra Live comments where people were claiming to run into the NPC Jar White before he was turned into a puppet. I haven't found any confirmation for this. I feel like pages like Zully the Witch would have debunked or found out whether or not this NPC was in the game or not. I definitely don't have the ability to go digging through the game files, but I don't think he was in the actual game. Other than that, I think he didn't add much other than just showing us what that type of person would be. And, that works perfectly as the Jar White puppet. He's hilarious to use and a great addition in terms of world building. Next up, we have the Great Jar's Arsenal, the Great Jar, which I failed to mention in the beginning, is a massive jar standing in front of the Colosseum in Caelid, who, when you approach him, he doesn't say anything other than, ... But he basically manifests 3 warriors for you to fight in the form of red summon signs, and I believe they're created via randomized character builds from other players, I believe, or something. But it can be kind of tricky to get past them. But basically, he grants you this after you defeat all 3 of them, and the charm reads, a charm that resembles a great jar overflowing with weaponry, vastly boosts maximum equipment load. The Great Jar grants his talisman to their warriors, carry as much as you can, grow big and strong. Now this, another reference to how the jars carry many warriors and many great beings from battles fought in previous, years and eras and all that. But the Great Jar, he says to carry as much as you can, grow big and strong. He's got to the point where he can't even move, and he's plopped himself right in front of the Colosseum of Caelid, basically standing there for any challenger who wants a piece of him, and there he stands, as the seneschal of that place. And there isn't much more to him other than, I imagine he's what all jars aspire to be, the Great Jar. They aspire to get that big, be that full of great warriors, and to just find a nice spot for them to continuously just get bigger and bigger. Now, next up, I say we have the hilariously named Soul Jars of Fortune. Ashern remains in which the spirits yet dwell. These reckless spirits sacrifice themselves to vanquish their summoner's foes and explode upon death. Though their bravery is admirable, their explosions can harm friend as well as foe, and they will also immediately explode on contact with fire. Tell the others. Tell them how brightly a fire jar burns. Now, I believe this bit of text basically separates the warrior jars from the fire jars. Now, I believe the fire jars are the ones that are made of a black jar as opposed to the normal brass-looking tan ones we see. These ones are often found in catacombs, maybe a couple legacy dungeons, but they explode when destroyed and explode if you throw a fireball at them. They're very volatile. Now, this shows me that they're, aside from the stewed remains inside the fire jars, that there's some kind of oil or magical, maybe possible flammable substance that gives them this ability. And they also have the ability to ignite themselves and kamikaze bomb, as I've stated earlier in the video. Basically, it shows us that maybe they're more reckless. They're filled with the more reckless remains and stewed remains of warriors who maybe were a little bit not all there, but were wild and ferocious enough to be gathered and claimed as, filling for these jars. Next up, we have the really a jar item, but it is something that I feel like it needs to be mentioned. The raw meat dumpling, which you get from occasionally from killing these little jars. It simply says a pungent raw meatball made succulent by virtue of being on the verge of turning. Not recommended for those who prefer to know the origin of their meats. Now, this is often found when you kill a jar. That tells me that whatever's magical inside of me keeps the meats and the stewed flesh and all that at least partially preserved until the jar is destroyed or shattered, at which point it is on the verge of turning almost immediately, and you got to eat it right away at the detriment of you. It poisons you. Just something I found interesting that they dropped. Next, we have the Jar Aromatic, which I also found to be not really necessarily a jar item, but it does have mention of the jars. It says, forbidden art of the depraved perfumers, craftable with a perfume bottle. Uses FP to temporarily turn body to steel, boosting poise resistances, damage negation at the expense of mobility, and vulnerability to lightning. An art that requires fragments of the hunted noble jars. Depraved perfumers are plainly in league with the jar poachers. So that tells us that the famous depraved perfumers that we see around were among the poachers that hunted jars for their innards, just to make perfume things that gave them similar abilities to the jar, like hardening abilities. And it basically shows that the depraved perfumers were assholes, but that doesn't really tell us anything new. I mean, they look really cool, and the Omen killers look really cool, but they're probably a bunch of fucking assholes. Next up, we have the ritual pot that, again, maybe not isn't a drop from any of the jars or anything like that, but if you look at it, it clearly resembles the jars that they are, with just without the arms and legs sprouting out of it and the red lid. And it basically just says that it's an empty pot that somehow mends itself when broken. Special item with greater durability than a cracked pot. That tells us that whatever the material used to make the outer jar is, at least it holds some kind of valuable self-mending healing property, magical properties for sure. But it says the materials and magic sealed within deploy the effects when the pot is thrown. Now that just has to do with the crafting and the ability to make little grenades. But I just thought it was another interesting thing to mention, given that we see Alexander with cracks and then him mending the cracks later on and hardening himself in lava, which it felt relevant. Anyway, moving on, we have the very unfortunate shard of Alexander. I mean, it's a warrior shard if you don't go through his quest line before you get it, but the description, at least, it just is the same except for added flavor text for Alexander. I mean, it reads, Shard of the late Alexander, Shatter Warrior Jar, spoiler alert. Greatly boost the attack power of skills. Scraps of stewed flesh cling to the shard, and tatters of ornaments can be seen mingled within the slime. Relics of a red-haired champion, it would seem. Alright, now we're into one of the most, tinfoil hat-y pieces of Alexander in the jars. Now it says specifically, relics of a red-haired champion, it would seem. Now at first I was wondering who could this be. We have various red-haired people throughout the lore. We have Radagon. It could be just any fire giant, maybe. It could be, at the time of my playing, I was like, maybe Melinia's remains. Possibly, who could it be? Someone with red hair. And then it dawned on me that when we see a rather crestfallen Alexander on the field after Radagon's defeat, we see him going through remains of various bodies. We don't see exactly the bodies he's going through, but he's basically using these bodies to get stronger, which is another thing I'll talk about. But it's not exactly unfeasible to think that he grabbed the remains of Radagon himself, who was red-haired and a great champion and warrior, and threw him in the jar. I mean, it would be a great way for Radagon's remains to keep going. I mean, he was a noble warrior who really drew the short straw in his fight with Melinia. She went nuclear, destroyed the whole fucking goddamn region of Caelid in the process just to beat her half brother. And now the man survived, to some degree. It wandered, mindlessly through the wasteland, as we all know, and if it wasn't for Jaren, maybe a good death would have never came to Radon. But this is an interesting way of looking at it as a way that Radon continued to exist within Alexander, because the dude deserved better than what he got. But again, just a theory. One piece of evidence that seems to support the theory would be that if Alexander is killed without progressing his quest, he simply drops a warrior shard, which says that it remains of noble remains, whereas if killed after his quest line, it says the remains of a red-haired champion, which seems to possibly confirm that he didn't get the red-haired champion until after the fight with Radon. Possibly, how these things are, but again, just a theory. Moving on. We have another famous piece, Alexander's Inners. Now, it wasn't until, I think, the patch 1.3 that these were even usable. Other than that, people didn't know what to do with them. There was data files that said take them to Jarberg, but nothing could be done. I myself took them there several times, trying to find something to do. I took them to the Great Pot and Kaled. I took them everywhere. Took them to that random finger reader who told me to break a pot, unknowing that she was actually talking about the guy in the Albinoric village. But these eventually do have their place, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but they do have a purpose and place. Now, this specifically says, a keepsake of the warrior Jar Alexander, found at the core of dead flesh that once filled the great jar. The jars contain dregs inherited from those who came before, thus our warriors pass from jar to jar carrying dreams of greatness. Now, this also tells me, as basically stuff that I've already gone over, that the jar warriors are warriors passed from jar to jar. But it's interesting that it says it carries their dreams, so that bits of these warriors remain inside the jar's personality. Like in Alexander's case, he was probably filled with a bunch of particularly noble warriors, and his personality it goes to. We don't know whether or not it was altered as he adds people to him, but perhaps it was, perhaps adding Radon to him, again, just a theory, made him more fierce, and that's why, in comparison to his fight with Radon, when you see him, if you summon him for the battle of the fire giant, the guy is basically indestructible. Like, he has like an insane amount of health. I was surprised. I just thought he'd summon him and he would instantly kind of maybe get destroyed, or he would provide a little bit of a distraction, but the guy is actually pretty useful in that damn fight. But then again, the summons in this game are a lot better than they were in something like maybe Dark Souls 2. But anyway, I digress. Moving on. Now we have the Companion Jar, a talisman given by the jars to their friends. Though the jars are brought to life by human flesh and blood, they are all rather kindly folk. Perhaps they were made to be better than their innards. So this tells us that, even the semi-omniscient narrator that writes all these descriptions isn't entirely sure on the origin and nature of the jars. All we know for sure is that they're brought to life by human flesh and blood and magic, and possibly the material making the jars themselves are magic, and it keeps them going. Again, it's impossible to say. I'm just giving out possibilities. That if that were the case, it would make them a type of like bio machine, I guess you could say, that they're, magical bio machine. I don't know. It gets messy when you go into deep high fantasy shit like that. But I like this little bit where it says perhaps they were made to be better than their innards. Now their innards are all probably violent, warriors to varying degrees of morals, and all the jars are extremely friendly. At least the ones we meet and don't try to steal from. They're look at Jarberg. It's one of the most, if not the most peaceful place in the entire game. And the jars there, they welcome you to pick their harvest. To go ahead, help yourself, be friendly. Just don't tell the location of the place to any of the poachers, and it's all good. And the good friends are given the Companion Jar. I thought it was a rather cool little item. It was another one that people were wondering how to get back when the quest was broken, but now it's in the game and it's obtainable really rather easily. You just got to progress a quest line. Moving on. Now, I believe that was all the item descriptions involving the jars. Now, basically with all of that, we can come to our own conclusions of what exactly the jars are and who made them. I'd say, the biggest two magical schools around were Ray Lucaria and the Carian, not magic schools, but magic factions, with the Carian nobles and their knights, and the Ray Lucarian school, which, it doesn't seem like something they would do, but I wouldn't put it past them. Look at the arcane spheres of faces, which I can make a whole video about what the hell those are, and we wouldn't really have a straight answer. I guess it's just like this. We can only really theorize, but they could either be made that way. They could have something to do with the Erd tree. When it comes to all the jars littering the area around the minor Erd trees. Um, they could have. I rule out the perfumers and the omen killers because it says that the perfumers, at least the depraved ones, not the royal ones, that they hunted them for their innards to make perfume out of them. But I'd rule out them being their creators, because if they knew how to make them, they would just, make them and then hunt them. But other than that, I don't think they have anything to do with America or the Golden Will or anything like that, or the Greater Will or the Outer Gods. I don't think they really have anything to do with any of the deeper lore. I think that they're just likely something's experiment that similar to the super mutants maybe in Fallout 3, where they're an experiment that kind of started just kind of kept perpetuating itself. Like these mutants, they kidnap people and created more. I'm not saying the jars do this. I just mean it's similar in the sense that what began out as a type of mad science experiment, or in this case magical experiment, became something all its own, and it gained its own culture and adherence to it, and even people who want to be like them, aspirants, like the Jar White guy, the NPC version that I hear people talk about, who wanted nothing more than to just be the innards of a jar. He wanted to continue on eternally as the innards of a jar. Which, if these type of things existed in real life, there'd undoubtedly be people who want to do that. There's really something for everybody in the world these days, especially with the internet. But to go on, I'd say it's almost certain that it's the jars that currently are what create more jars and perpetuate, the living jars, because we don't see any evidence to suggest otherwise. Like they really do have their own culture and their own ways that seem to be foreign to just about everybody. I mean, there are some people like Dialos that when they do find the Jarberg, they're like, oh shit, this place, it is the most peaceful place in the game, and I'd like to live here and defend it. And sure enough, since it's a FromSoft game, as soon as he does that, the place gets attacked, and we know what happens to Dialos. But an interesting note I thought about Dialos was that Jar Baron, he doesn't consider Dialos a great warrior at all. He considers him nice, he has soft hands, which is something else I want to go into in a second. But they say he has soft hands and that he's a nice guy, but he's not a warrior like the player character. And sure enough, when he does die, though, we see Jar Baron gather what appears to be gathering his remains in the same way that Alexander was possibly grabbing Radahn's remains and the warriors that challenged him, standing over Mr. Dialos, saying that the tale of House Hoslow is told in blood, and he's what appears to be, like he said, he's gathering his remains, to continue Dialos' story, much in the same way that Alexander's and Radahn's continue with Jar Baron at the end of his quest line. Dialos might not have considered himself a great warrior, but Jar Baron did, to the point where he has him, right there with the likes of great warriors like Radahn and Alexander, and who knows who else. Which I thought was an interesting thing. They're not just valuing strength, even though the Jar Baron is a warrior jar. He values Dialos' bravery in spite of his skill. Like, he defended what he stood up for. He stood up for the jars. He tried to defend them. He died doing it. That's he died a man and a great warrior in Jar Baron's eyes, and I thought that was really interesting. But another thing I wanted to say, especially when you consider the description of Jar White's jar, that only those worthy warriors are able to be inducted inside the jar. Now that tells me that it's not just skill will get you in it, but heroic and brave acts will definitely earn you the respect of a jar, to the point where he'd want to add you, to his insides. Which I think it tells a lot without telling a lot, and I think that's that could be said about these entire series. But moving on, last one of the things I wanted to mention was their touch of feel. Their sense of touch and feel, which I thought was bizarre and interesting, because they're jars. They can, Jar Baron specifically says Dialos' hands feel soft when he pats them. That means that these jars have a sense of feel on the outside. That means that every jar we've shattered has felt that shit. And who the fuck knows what that shit feels like? We see Alexander with a giant crack in him that he received from Radahn. And who the fuck, that's gotta feel like breaking a bone. But that's just an interesting observation, I thought, was that whoever created the jars gave them innate ability to have touch and feel. I mean, I guess that would make sense, they would, but they don't wield weapons. They just punch. And I guess, since they have this touch, it leads to them doing things like gardening and, agriculture, and just sunbathing, you know, stuff like that you wouldn't expect a sentient pot to be doing. But yeah, that's it. I guess the video kind of might have been all over the place. It's a lot longer than I expected it to be, but I guess that's no big deal. This is my first video like this. I'm gonna make more. Not even hopefully, but they will get better. You know, they'll get more organized. This one was kind of, you know, me firing on all cylinders, but you know, if anything, I hope it was informative. I hope people enjoyed, and if you liked it, please subscribe and drop a like. If there's anything I missed, definitely comment. I don't feel like, you know, I'm being corrected or anything, because there's definitely probably stuff I missed. But that's all I have so far, and I hope you guys all have a good one. See ya.